Right, welcome everybody to the fifth webinar in our PyQ Intelligence for the Future series. I'm Alison Jones, I'm the Director of Practical Inspiration Publishing, host of the Extraordinary Business Book Club podcast. It's very, very good to have you here. And the aim of these webinars is to explore how work is changing in these unprecedented times, of course, and also to give us the insights and the strategies and the skills to help us navigate that transformation better. And we've got some brilliant practical inspiration speakers lined up over the coming weeks. If you have a particular topic that you would like us to cover that we aren't covering, or any feedback on how we can make these sessions even more useful, then do drop me a line afterwards. It's alison@alisonjones.com. So a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce Lucinda properly. Your audio and video should both be off, and if you don't mind, we're going to keep it that way to avoid those random sounds that can ruin a Zoom call. So if you have questions or comments, if you could just put those in the chat, and please do, as they occur to you, put them in. I'll be keeping an eye on that, and I will either invite you to put your questions to Lucinda, or depending on how we're doing for time, I will put them to her myself, but we'll try and get through all the questions. So the session, as you know, is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the full recording afterwards. And I'm also going to be putting the talk, not the Q&A, but just the talk itself on YouTube publicly. Right, all the housekeeping out of the way, let me introduce today's speaker. I'm very, very pleased to introduce Lucinda Carney, who is a chartered occupational psychologist with many years corporate HR experience leading and delivering system and culture change. And in her role as CEO and founder of Actors Software, she works with a wide variety of business professionals in a range of sectors and shares that knowledge in a load of really powerful case studies. And she's also the host of the HR Uprising podcast and the author of How to Be a Change Superhero, which is coming out with spectacular timing on the 21st of May. So welcome, Lucinda.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here, because if we ever needed a change superhero, it's now, isn't it?
There's a lot of change going on, that is for sure.
So would you like to start your presentation?
Yes, okay. I'll just make sure the technology works, hopefully.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, we've already practiced it like 10 times. Right. Okay, so I'm hoping that you can see the correct slides. I've got two webcams going on here, so I'm looking at the top screen. Is that correct? Can you see it?
Well, I can. That's good.
Super. Okay, we'll assume everybody else can. So hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming and listening into this webinar. Alison's obviously introduced myself, so I'm just going to jump straight into the content. And what I've done is I've lifted some of the concepts from the book around how we can be great at dealing with change ourselves, and also how we can help others to deal with change. Obviously, there are lots of other concepts that we cover in the book in other areas about organisational and large-scale change. But I'm just going to focus in on the individual, because that's something that's applicable to all of us. And as we go through it, I'll put in place with some examples that maybe everyone can identify with, because we've just been through this huge change. If you think about going into lockdown as an example, for example. So the quote here, the Peter Senge quote, I think it's always really useful for us to think about if we're involved in change, because actually generally, although we do hear about people being in denial about change or resisting change, often it's not the case. It's just the fact that that change has been presented to them in a way that they consider it to be a fait accompli. They don't understand what's in it for them. They feel like it's being done to them, as opposed to them being encouraged to come along as willing participants in the change. And it's my absolute belief that if we could just flip that around a bit by thinking about how we take people with us on change and involve people in change and communicate change, then we could actually make it a lot more palatable for people, and also we could help people adapt to things much more quickly. And why I think this is so important at the moment is that I'm sure many of us will have heard that there's concerns about well-being in the workplace, mental health issues. One of the issues about you feeling like you're having change forced upon you is it can result in depression. There are a number of negative emotions attached to it, and therefore we need to consider whatever our roles, whether it's socially or back in the workplace, how we can help empower people to minimize the negative aspects of people feeling like change is being thrust upon them. So I believe that if we put in practice some of the ideas that I'm going to run through, many of which I'm sure you will have come across, it's not complete rocket science, lots of it's common sense, but if we think about it, then we can actually help people be more just support well-being as we go back into it, as we change back into the new way of working. So in my book, how to be a change superhero, I've come up with 5 superpowers of a change superhero, and you can see them here. I've made them all connect with strategies almost to see, had a bit of a workaround here. So the 5 C's of being a change superhero. And as you can see, I've said they're courage, it's connecting with strategy, it's corroboration, communication, and collaboration. And in the interest of time, I'm going to go through the first 3 in a little bit of detail. And then I'll just touch on the final 2. So in terms of courage, why do we need to be courageous to be a change superhero? Well, there are lots of things. If you're leading an organisational change, you can imagine that actually the change leaders do have to stand up, put their heads above the parapet. They may have to communicate change that might not be perceived as popular, because effectively they're going ahead of the curve. So it does take courage to actually be prepared to do that in the first place. On top of that, I believe we need to have the courage, if we want to be leaders of change and to support others through change, to actually reflect internally and have the self-awareness about how we respond to change. And it actually doesn't really matter. In fact, this is a premise that I would say it's a stream throughout my whole book, which is actually it doesn't matter whether you love change or you hate change. The point is change is going to come, and what we need to be able to do is to be flexible. In the same way as I'll look at other aspects of personalities, we're all different as individuals. What we need, though, is to make sure that we appreciate our own nuances and how that may be advantageous or disadvantageous when we're communicating change with others, because it can mean that we put people off, or we don't have empathy for the situation of others. So we need to have the courage to understand how we respond to change and how we like to communicate, and to be prepared to flex it. The other thing I feel, which is really relevant to how we've been in terms of the lockdown situation, and these principles in courage are very much around emotional intelligence, which I'm sure many people have heard of. One of the ways of I suppose managing your mental state and minimizing anxiety is about focusing on what you actually can control about a situation. And that is a theme in terms of change, is about helping people think about actually what they can do about a change, what's within their remit. So for example, if we've gone into lockdown, people can't control that they're, where they're going to work. They're having to work at home with many people have got, helpers in the form of small children, in inverted commas, helpers. But there's many challenges about things which are out of people's control, and that's one of the reasons people get really quite anxious, because they feel out of control. But what we can do is control on things that like our routine, what we're eating, the way in which we're working, the way we interact with others. There are lots of things that we can control, but it takes courage and it takes self-motivation to do that. The other aspect of change for me is about being prepared. You don't have to be the person that it's all about you. So it's actually being courageous can be being prepared to follow others and support others in delivering change. So that's my starting point, and that controlling what you can control is really important. The second one is about connecting with strategy. And this, in an organisational change, it's really about helping people understand the why. Why do we need to do this in the first place? So we need to have a vision and provide people with a sense of meaning. The reason that that's so important is that then means that, as a change agent, we can lead people the way, but we can't make everybody follow a certain direction. We need people to choose to follow us. And often they choose, when they understand the why, that actually takes away some of the objections as to why they don't want to. And it's interesting, I was reflecting on as we came into the lockdown. If you think right at the start, about 8 weeks ago, we were seeing that other countries were suffering with the coronavirus. They'd had lockdown. The sort of terminology that we'd heard at that point was that it was about herd immunity. And that younger people didn't necessarily suffer as much as over 70s, say. So what I didn't understand right at the start was, why were we being locked down? It didn't really make sense, because if we're locking down, then we're not going to get the herd immunity. And then the let's protect the NHS message started to come out more strongly in terms of that. And I remember also reading about something to do with viral load, that if we all carried out going on infecting people at a high level, understanding quite how infectious coronavirus was, once I understood that logical, the facts as to that made sense, it was far more contagious than other things. And also the government started coming out with this stay at home, save lives, save the NHS. Now that is a really powerful vision for many people in the UK. I'm interested as to why some of the other countries, whether it was less strong, you can see some of the other countries people are resisting. You've seen people not being so positive, let's say in the States, saying you can't lock us down. But that was a very, very powerful why. And it gives us a vision that we can all get behind. And I think people will talk later about going through denial and resistance, but people understood why. And we knew what we had to do, stay at home. The achievable goals, okay, is that about we can go out for an hour's exercise? Is that broken into 3 20-minute chunks, or is it 1 hour, or how long, etc.? But those were all aspects of people going through the change once they got the point of it. The interesting thing for us to reflect on, and I don't know the answer to this, is having created quite a powerful why to get us into lockdown, what we're going to have to do in our organisations, and the government is going to have to do, is they're going to have to come up with just as important a why for us to go back to work. And those people who are anxious may suddenly go, well, if that was saving the NHS by me staying at home, what's my why now to go back and get on a tube? So there are going to be other things as we come back out, because this is change upon change upon change. But that's a really key point for me, is giving people a why to help them to follow a change for themselves. The other area that, in my experience, communication, particularly change communication in the workplace, can be really weak on. Often we say, you've just got to do this because, right? And we need to do this. Corroboration, this is about helping people, it's supporting the why. All right, so it's helping us corroborate that reason for change, and ideally with evidence. In this chapter, these are separate chapters in the book, so I talk about different influencing shortcuts. Cialdini talks about various forms of influence, and I've just picked out 3 of them here to focus on. So one of them would be appealing to authority. Now, again, going back to the government, communicating the coronavirus, saying obviously they were flanked a lot of the time, or almost every briefing I saw, they would be flanked by medical or scientific experts. So they were appealing to authority by having that sense of science attached to it. And that made it more credible, particularly, where people have cynicism about whether they believe governments, etc., etc. Other ways of influencing, and of course, if we apply that in the workplace away from coronavirus, it might be about, if we're a financial services organisation, referring to the FCA, or laws like GDPR. We've got to do such and such because of GDPR. They're shortcuts. Authority means we need to do this because. Not necessarily that motivational, you notice. Most people groan at the thought of GDPR, but nevertheless, it's a way of influencing. And my recommendation is we should be using 2 or 3 different methods of influencing, and not just refer to the science, not just refer to the these other aspects. Then social proof is another nice one. That's often about case studies. So you might look outside of your organisation how other people have been successful or unsuccessful, and share examples of that. So that's social proof. I mean, when we looked overseas, looking at what was going on in Italy, that was social proof of what happens, when things go, when the coronavirus takes hold. So all of those are ways we're looking around and we're getting social proof, which influenced us to adhere to a lockdown, for example. And then reciprocation. This is this concept of exchange. So if we want someone to do something, we might offer, it doesn't have to be money, it might be offer something in return. So, if someone's going to work longer hours for you, you might offer them time off in lieu or a bonus payment. In these circumstances, the government had to put in place furloughing of financial measures and CBILS loans and things like that. So there were other areas that took away, the reciprocation influenced people because it took away some of the objections as to why we couldn't do it and made it potentially worthwhile. It's quite a powerful influencer. The key with all of these is the evidence we use needs to be relevant to the audience. So there's no point in talking about using a strategic health authority if you're talking to somebody who is a porter or something. It's not relevant to them. You want to use authorities that are recognisable in that industry, let's say. And I'd also say try to be creative and varied with all of these things. Variety, flexibility, creativity is the way to go. So those are the first 3 I wanted to focus on. And then the second 2 are about communication. There's so much about communication. It's really about being very flexible. It's about understanding how people are motivated. Some people are towards, some people are away motivated. They're carrot and stick, and making sure that our the way in which we communicate with people is flexible. And then the final one is about collaboration. And that's building on this idea you can't do it on your own. For us to do anything, to have a change, you need to create almost a change league of people. And the key with that is making sure that we really appreciate diversity. We have a tendency as human beings to get on most easily with people who are like us, but actually in terms of a team, that's not the right answer, because we're going to have the same blind spots. So think about how you can work with other people who will look at things in a different way, welcome those diverse viewpoints, because those diverse viewpoints in your change team will help you then realize how more and more people will respond to that change, and they'll make you more flexible in terms of taking people with you. They can help you refine that messaging, and they can help you, I think of it like ripples in a pond. One stone can't get to the outside, or it will be very, very small ripples by the time it gets to the outside of a lake. But if we have a number of stones all going in the same direction, then those ripples are going much stronger, and we're all going to get out there. And it's this sort of knock-on effect. So those are the traits for me to think about in relation to communication. And then what we then need to think about is how people respond and react to change. So I'm sure many of you will have come across this. It's called the transition curve. And a lady called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with it in the 60s, and it was all related to how people go through grief. And actually, we do go through predictable stages of grief, and you can go through rapidly or slowly, and you can go backwards and forwards along the curve. Now, this has been tweaked, if you like, to make it more business related. And I think you'll probably recognize some of these terms that you've seen here. So right at the start, again, if we use the analogy of what we've just been through, people were in denial to start with. Lots of people going, I'll keep my head down, it'll go away. We've had these things, it's no different from any other flu. Why are we all making a meal of it? It's just the media are blowing it up into nothing. So denying there's a problem. Sunbathing in the park is fine during lockdown. My 75-year-old father-in-law, being determined that he still has to walk to the corner shop for his non-essential trip to go and get the paper every day. All of that's denial, carrying on as if nothing's changed. Then people move into this stage where it's more active resistance. So, we can't possibly, there were businesses, I'm on a lot of HR groups, there were businesses where despite the government saying you need to lock down, they were not allowing people to work at home, saying we can't do it. And some of this is to do with trust, some of it's we don't have the tools to work remotely. They were resisting and pushing back, saying it's not able to do it. I haven't got time to make this happen. This isn't possible. We don't need to do this. It's different here. I was thinking of the fact that Mike Ashley contacted the government and said, come on, we're a different, Sports Direct is an essential provider. That's all kind of resisting the change. And the point with this is that's all very much looking at how things are, resisting moving to the future. We then go through a bit of a realization, acceptance, possibly depression. And this again is where we link to risks with people for mental health in these circumstances. And then once we get over to the right-hand side of the curve, it's more about exploration. So then people moved into, which collaboration tech is best. People were coming on webinars on how to work remotely. What are my priorities? Could I use this for it? Should we run a team quiz on the Friday? These are much more positive. Now, the thing about resistance and exploration is that they are, as you see the difference, they're speech bubbles. So you hear those, whereas the denial and commitment tends to go on in people's heads. The big risk about that is that we can think that someone is in commitment where they're going, great, I can get my team to manage their performance, or I've cracked the internet shopping, or I'm loving working at home, I'm not missing the commute. People are committed to this new way of working. Sometimes you can't tell the difference because that is quite quiet and seamless and people are just getting on with it, and as is denial. So in any kind of change, quite often a change agent needs to be prepared to check whether someone's in denial or commitment and not assume. When they're in resistance and exploration, is see resistance as positive, because often people think, oh God, it's such hard work. But actually, resistance is a sense of progress, even though it's noisy and can be a bit painful. It's a sense of progress away from denial. So see that as positive. On the next slide, I'll talk about how we can help people move on to the next key, because the point that we want to get to is to get everybody to commitment as soon as possible and as painlessly as possible. And we don't want people to fall back into depression where they're sort of stuck on that bottom of the curve. So what we can do as change superheroes or change agents is we can help people through those stages. And there's lots of things you can do. But what I would say is at the start, if someone's in denial, then we need to have the courage to challenge them, set clear expectations about the future, say that actually you can't carry on doing this. We have to speak up with empathy. We absolutely need to be empathetic, but we need to challenge those behaviours to move them into resistance. And it might be saying, so what is it? Why? Asking questions, open questions as to why they think it's okay to still go to the corner shop, or what do they need to do to actually work in this new way? What do they need? If people are in resistance, this is where it goes back to this connecting with strategy. They're resisting because they don't get it. They don't get why. So we need to explain why, and we also need to provide empathy as to why they feel that way, and listen to them. People need listening to at this stage rather than just answering everything and bouncing back. So the more we listen and empathize, the more people start to progress for themselves, and you can notice that they'll start to oscillate between the past and the future. And that's great because they're moving into exploration. They might ask, it might be a bit negatively worded, but they'll ask a question about what things could be like in the future, and that's a sign of progress. So the key was asking open questions, listening, empathizing, and explaining the why. Once they get into exploration, they're really starting to progress. And what we want then is to support them, reinforce their positive behaviors, answer questions, and empower them to come up with answers for themselves. And I'll lead now into where I'm thinking about as coming out of this lockdown. So I believe we are going to have a different way of working. We need to involve people in defining that change. So what is it you like about the way things are working now, and how could we take the best things about this setup and work on, that we've got going now, and go back to the workplace, because we need to be successful, we need to thrive as a business, we need to, sell our way out of this. But what would you need to make sure that you could be productive in a new workplace? Let's redefine our workplace. And then once people are committed to the new way of working, then we need to recognize them from doing that. We need to treat them as champions, and they're ideal people to collaborate with and bring into our change league. One thing to be aware of, just to be alert to, and I think this concerns me so much with organisational change, that's your change curve in terms of thinking of organisations freezing and unfreezing. Generally, you have a level of performance, and usually we put in place a change in order to increase our level of performance in the workplace. What happens is if we don't pull the whole organisation right through, then we can end up and we start another change. And sometimes I think about changes that have been done to the NHS in this, that we don't push something through and get the benefits of that change. What we do is we put in a new restructure or a new change. The risk is, if we don't make sure that change is embedded, people are moved through to commitment, and the benefits are realised, we can actually end up in declining performance. And usually change is to put in to improve performance. So that's just something to be aware of. I think that's quite a sort of a powerful visual in terms of how organisational change and successive change. And that's my slight concern about how we message our way out of this, in that we've got to the point where people are pretty much now going, okay, I know what I'm doing, I'm working remotely, I've got this. We're going to have to ask people to go back into the workplace. So how do we make sure that that is a positive outcome, is a challenge for many of us. So just in summary, looking to the future, I believe these circumstances, our psychological contract has changed, right? I believe, and I'd like to think, I think that as moving to this remote way of working, where it's been acceptable for small children to come into the background and us to be sitting in our tracksuit bottoms on stretchy clothes through on various collaboration technologies, it's become much more human, asking people how they're doing. We've become very transactional, I think, as businesses on the whole. So hopefully we've got this emphasis of people over task, and I think we're going to need to maintain that, because people will still be going through change as we go back into the workplace. And I think that's going to go on for a while. Some of the solution, in my opinion, is about giving people control. So that means asking them to be involved in how they want to work the workplace of the future. I think work-life balance needs to become real, in terms of something, as opposed to something which we used to pay lip service to. It's something that people will have realised there are benefits of them spending time with their family and not having to commute, and those things they're not going to automatically want to go back and work 14-hour days in the city overnight. And we ultimately are going to have to create new visions that people buy into, to get people to be really productive again. In terms of business productivity, it's obviously both have to work. People and the business has to win out of this if we're going to grow our way out of it. So those are my thoughts on this topic, and some of them are referenced from the book. I've always put this out as a fun picture from a presentation that we did last year, back in the days when we weren't socially distanced, and we were talking about being superheroes at a Festival of Work last year. But I believe that anybody can do this. It's just about thinking about how we do it and having that self-awareness and flexibility to support others and also to support ourselves through these really changing times. If you're interested in my book, and I know there's authors on here as well, so I was on the book challenge 12 months ago, I think it was. So this has kind of come almost exactly 12 months since I went through the 10-day business boot camp. Proposal challenge. I did the boot camp too. But my book, I'm really excited, is going to be available. So there's the links there for anybody who's interested in those. And then I'll just go on to my final slide to allow for some questions. In fact, I'll leave it on that one for if there's any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lucinda. I've scribbled nearly a full page of A4 notes here. And here Ruth has already put a question, which we'll come to a formal Q&A in a moment. But I just wanted to follow up on a couple of things that you talked about there. As I say, a lawful lot that I've not jotted down here, but there's one thing particularly. You talk about the Change League, and I know you talk about this in the book as well. I just thought that was a really interesting concept. Just tell us a little bit more about, because you're not doing this single-handed as a superhero, actually, are you? So tell us about the Change League. What's that all about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've got to be passionate about the change happening. It's not about us being the leader of it, and that for me, I think, is a change superhero who it's not all about. It's not all about me, and in a league of people, we've all got different strengths and weaknesses. In the book, I talk about Belbin's team roles, just because that's a really useful model to use. And if you look at change, essentially, there's different activities. I divide it into three. So at the start of the change, you've got to define it. You've got to inspire people. You've got to work out what the why is. You've got to energize people. So that's quite a people activity, and certain traits are good at that. So you get to get things started, get people galvanized. You need to be courageous and create some noise. You also need to do a bit of homework and make sure that you've properly thought about what that change is. That's probably a different person. So I know I'm okay at making the noise, but if you want to look in the detail, so that we don't get unstuck earlier, it's good to have someone who's looking through it more thoroughly, who's perhaps the custodian of process, like and again, in Belbin, this might be the coordinator. So for someone who's the project manager, who keeps us on track and has written out a plan. In the middle of it is things like we need to just keep getting on with things. We need to drive through. Often the person in Belbin terms, the resource investigator, who's great at starting things, they tend to be pretty useless at finishing things, and they'll lose interest. And I think that's one of the reasons that organisational change often fails, because we try to keep that same change team on the whole way through the journey. And actually, we've got different strengths. So it's being alert to your strengths, and then why not bring in different people? Once you get, let's say you've put in a system, right, a new system, you've defined it, you've done the vision, you've trained people. And for those who are easily bored, the exciting stuff's done. But there are people who are brilliant at implementation and are brilliant at dotting the I's and crossing the T's. Those are the people you want to bring in. And if you do that, that the thing about the successive change, if you do that and then refresh that Change League at that key point to keep the momentum going, that's when you get your change embedded into business as usual. That's when you get your benefits occurring, in my opinion, and that's where you start to get the value of having put the change in the first place. But in order to do that, you've got to appreciate that I know that socially, someone who's very detailed and process probably isn't the person that I naturally get on with. I've learned to massively appreciate those people because they make my life a lot easier. But in terms of the way they work, they do feel like they make life harder, and vice versa. I'm erratic. I drive mad people who want to follow a process or follow something. So the details. So that's the difference. Valuing differences and having that range of people at the right time.
Brilliant. And I love that you have a Change League with a custodian of process. It's sounding very Guardians of the Galaxy, isn't it?
Absolutely. I didn't think of that. I don't think I managed that in the book.
I love that. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Right, we're going to move to the Q&A. So listen. Thank you so much, Lucinda. There haven't been any more questions come through, so I think we can probably let you go, having picked your brains really quite thoroughly. So thank you. Some absolutely brilliant, really, really practical tips there for people to take away. And I think it's sort of a more profound understanding, given that change is the only certainty from now on, that we're all a little bit better equipped to deal with it. So thank you so much. And do join us next week. We've got Andy Salkelt on mental health for ourselves and for our people, just as we've been talking about change for ourselves and our people. So learning to live with a new normal as we look forward to the next stage of this crisis. And if you would like to explore becoming a practical inspiration author yourself, I would love to hear from you. We're very, very proud to be publishing leaders like Lucinda in a wide range of fields, and you can find out more at practicalinspiration.com. So that's it for today. And actually, I think we've got a couple of people who have done the proposal challenge and onto the boot camp at the moment. So hopefully seeing Lucinda, who did it this time last year, went through the boot camp in May, and here's the book being published this May. I hope that's a great encouragement to you as well. So thank you very much, everybody. Hope to see you back here next week for another Practical Inspiration webinar. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me, Alison.
Thanks,
guys. Bye.